All right, that was a bloodbath. Let's just be honest. I have only seen a few games that have reached the level of utter domination that this game did. Nebraska lost to Indiana, or more appropriately, Indiana destroyed Nebraska by a score of 56-7 on Big Noon Kickoff, on national television, in front of college football's, I would say, favorite play-by-play and color commentary duo in Gus Johnson and Joel Klatt. It was disgusting. Within about a few drives, you knew that Indiana was going to win. It was just a question of how bad the game was going to turn out for Nebraska and how impressive Indiana was going to look. Indiana even had their starting quarterback injured. He didn't play after halftime, and Indiana still put up 28 points in the second half, just like they did in the first half. 7 points in the first quarter, 21 in the second quarter, 14 in both the third and the fourth, 56-7. It was a total depantsing on part of Indiana and Curt Cignetti. And the only games that I can think of that were close to this, that were similar, some even more extreme, others toned down a little bit, maybe by the scoreboard or in general, are Ohio State versus Michigan State in 2021, which was also 56-7, but 49-0 at the half. Georgia versus Michigan in 2021 in the Orange Bowl. Georgia versus TCU in the 2022 National Championship game. Penn State versus Michigan State last year was about as competitive as this game was, and that was an utter blowout. Michigan versus Michigan State. Michigan versus Nebraska of last year. This loss was just, it was bad. It was terrible if you're a Nebraska fan, if you are Matt Rhule, if you are a Nebraska player. And if you're Indiana, well, if no one has bought into your program yet, they're idiots, because Indiana right now is top 15 in just about every power rating that I care about. They're top 5 in ESPN efficiency. And I picked Indiana to win. I picked them to win 28-14. I did not see a world where Indiana was going to win 56-7 and make Nebraska look like a MAC school while they look like prime Nick Saban, Alabama. I did not expect that to happen. I thought that there was a chance for Indiana to hang 30-40 points and perhaps win in dominant fashion. But this, winning 56-7, forcing 5 turnovers, making Nebraska completely lose their minds and lose their identity, especially in the second half of this game. Kudos to Curt Cignetti and to the Indiana Hoosiers. I think Indiana right now is one of the best teams in all of college football. If you look at just how teams are performing given their schedule, and you take out recruiting rankings, you take out priors, you take out all the other things that are factored into power ratings, Indiana's a top 5 team. They're not even top 10. The way that they've played in every game is indicative of a elite team, not just a near elite team. The reason the near elite moniker, the near elite adjective, name tag, I think is still appropriate is because just like before this game, Indiana has still played no one of significance relative to winning the Big Ten, relative to being a top 25 team, certainly no one relative to even winning or competing for a college football playoff appearance/game national championship, whatever. We have a lot to get into, and I'm bouncing all over the place because what else am I supposed to do? This was a one-sided affair, and as a result, we have a lot of deservingly extreme takeaways for both sides because the result was extreme. The distance between these two teams is multiple football fields. And while Indiana would not be favored to beat Nebraska by 49 points tomorrow if they met, because that's not how point spreads work, they would beat them again. They would beat them 10 out of 10 times. They outcoached Nebraska. They outplayed Nebraska. They outschemed Nebraska. Indiana made the better second half adjustments, and I would argue in part, while they weren't fully coasting, There's a reason they put Taven Jackson back in when they probably could have put Curtis Rourke back in. It doesn't sound like his injury is all that severe. He'll be back. I just think Curt Cignetti and Mike Shanahan and their staff are playing the long game here. They know they can compete for the college football playoff, and you want your best player back for that. But anyway, let's get into this game, and before we do, please subscribe to the channel, please hit the notification bell, like the video, share this channel around, join our Discord server where we talk college football 24/7 via the link in the description. Comment your reaction to this game. And also, if you want to support the channel monetarily and you love the work we do here, please sign up on our Patreon page as a paid member and purchase merchandise from my merchandise store. The link to the Discord server, Patreon page, and merch store are both in the description. They're also down below in the pinned comments. Same with my Twitter handle. I encourage you to follow there if you want to get some of my sometimes instant reactions or just off-record reactions. Off-record as in they're not always on YouTube. Some pretty entertaining and good stuff on there. But again, like the video, share, subscribe, hit the bell, comment, watch this all the way through and join the Discord server. Those things are free, and those things support the channel the most, even more than the Patreon page, which I would love for you to join, but your support's appreciated. It's not expected. But let's get down to business here and briefly go over these statistics, look at the bird's eye view, and then really dive in here to some points that I have. Nebraska, if I told you that entering this game, that Indiana would run for 5 touchdowns, you would not have believed me. You would have looked at me and asked if I all of a sudden became Jesse from Breaking Bad, and I just ate a bunch of blue meth and then died and was resurrected from the dead. Well, Indiana did that. And on top of that, they ran for 6.5 yards per carry, 215 rushing yards. They made Nebraska's players look like they didn't know what they were doing, or when they did, they couldn't stop it. Indiana's offensive line was dominant. The team was dominant. Again, total mismatch here. And you see that in the statistics. Indiana had a points per play margin of plus 0.827. That means for every one of Indiana's plays compared to every one of Nebraska's plays, Indiana scored 0.827 more points per play compared to Nebraska's play. That is utter nonsense if you're Nebraska's staff and players. That is amazing, phenomenal, praiseworthy if you are Curt Cignetti and you are Indiana's staff and Indiana's players. Indiana averaged 8.3 yards per play. Nebraska averaged 3.9. There's this one play before half. It was on the long touchdown run that Indiana had from, I forget if it was Tyson Lawton or Justice Ellison. It was Justice Ellison, had a 31-yard touchdown run. That run that he had, he made Deshaun Singleton look like a high school player. Deshaun Singleton spun around and then didn't know where he was because of the cutback. It reminded me a lot of Donovan Edwards' touchdown run on Penn State in 2022, where whatever DB was trying to tackle him just got spun around, totally lost, broke his ankles. And it didn't matter who was covering Indiana's receivers, whether it was Marquise Buford, whether it was Tommy Hill. I heard that C.R. Wright got benched, but I think he was out there a few times. They all got torched. They all got burned. Couldn't do anything. One-on-one, wide open, tackling in space didn't matter. They lost all of those battles. Nebraska did. And Indiana won all of them. Curtis Rourke was throwing dimes. Surratt was making insane catches. And then, of course, when you just look at all of these different things here, the running backs from Indiana performed at a phenomenal level. Justice Ellison had a great game. Tyson Lawton had a good game. Taven Jackson looked like one of the nation's better quarterbacks in the backup role. It was total domination by Indiana. And Indiana also forced 5 turnovers. They only gave up 1. That was before the half on a Hail Mary attempt. So really, you could say that Indiana was +5 in the turnover department, because unless that pick was returned for 6, it didn't mean anything. It might as well have been an incomplete pass. Indiana had 4 penalties for 46 yards. Nebraska had 6 penalties for 47 yards. Yeah, and some other statistics that really show how dominant this game is Nebraska was 0 of 5 on 4th down, 7 of 16 on 3rd down. Something that is going to kill Nebraska in future games, and also after this year, if Ed Foley and the special teams aren't fixed, is the special teams. Already gave away the answer there. Because Nebraska, when I'm watching them drive down the field as they are, and you know they have to go for it on fourth down, in this game they should have, because you could tell early on that Indiana was aggressive, they wanted to score, they were able to score. But let's say Nebraska's playing UCLA, and UCLA scores an early touchdown. You know that UCLA does not have the offense that Indiana does, and you know that you'll probably hold them to high teens, low 20s, maybe even lower than that. Same with USC, because their offense is kind of broken. Probably the same thing with Wisconsin. They've played some weak competition where they've looked good, and Iowa's offense, while better, is still Iowa. And you can't kick a field goal, and you go 0 of 5 on fourth down. If you just had a kicker, you could stack points and be confident, but instead what you get is you get an all-or-nothing offense from Nebraska, and if all that does is add pressure to the offense, and a part of me honestly thinks that's what the Dante Dowdle fumble was. He had the fourth down, he had it, but he fumbled it. And at that moment, you could gain the sense that, oh man, that was Nebraska's chance, and they don't have a kicker, so they really blew it. Like, that was the only outcome there. There was no, well, what if we kick the field goal and we're only down by 4? That's not how that works with Nebraska, because the special teams is that broken. And everything in this game was as broken as the special teams unit is under Ed Foley currently. It was a bad overall performance, and I want to reflect what John Johnston on Core Nation said, because this really resonated with me, not just because I'm a fan of the Big Ten. I feel like I can empathize with a lot of Big Ten programs, and but also Michigan, my team. Michigan sucks. Michigan is awful, and I wouldn't be shocked if Michigan fired their entire coaching staff and, well, just looks like a totally different team next year. That wouldn't shock me one bit. But my point in saying that is John Johnston mainly, said this on Core Nation, that Matt Rhule's goodwill was lost after this game in large part. And it felt like that. I picked Indiana to win this matchup because to me it was clear statistically they were the better team. And I didn't think that Curt Cignetti was going to be this amazing coach or even a good coach relative to the Power Four entering this year. But I didn't view him as an inexperienced, lost, new head coach. He was clearly experienced. Clearly in the first 6 games they were playing at a very high level. And while Nebraska was a better team, in my view, than anyone they had faced prior, and maybe that's no longer the case anymore, I still think it is, maybe not by a mile now, though, I didn't think they were just going to lay down and die. And Nebraska has enough issues on offense to where I knew that if they were going to win, it was going to be close. There was no way that Nebraska was going to expose Indiana. They weren't built to do that. And I thought that because of Indiana's special teams advantage, the fact that they're not as all or nothing on both sides of the football, but mainly offense, that they would win. And they won, but they won in dominant fashion, and everything that Matt Rhule wants Nebraska to be. We want to be physical. We want to run the ball. We want to play good defense. We don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot. That all went out the window. All went out the window. And guess who's on the chopping block, or who is going to put Nebraska on the chopping block this coming Saturday? You got Ryan Day in Ohio State. So take from that what you will. I think it's unacceptable to lose by 7 touchdowns no matter who you are. That's unacceptable to happen to Indiana. That's unacceptable to happen to Rutgers, to Maryland, to Illinois, to Purdue, to Northwestern. I mean, Wisconsin beat Purdue, I think, what was it? Was it 52-6? Yes, 52-6. They beat Purdue 52-6. And in that game, we were talking about Ryan Walters being fired. Now, I know Purdue also lost to Notre Dame 66-7. But this result was as bad as Purdue's loss to Wisconsin. That's how bad this loss was. And I'm tripping over my words because I can't even believe I'm saying this. I don't think Rhule should be fired. I don't think that should even be in the conversation. But this is unacceptable. This is bad. This is a loss that should motivate change. And I don't know where the change will be directed to, because we already knew the special teams sucked. They already do suck. But they weren't the problem in this game. Even if Nebraska was able to make long field goals, congratulations. You lose 56-13 or 16 instead of 56-7. That's what happens. And all this does is add on to the belief and the theory that, Matt Rhule, he's 2-21 versus top 25 teams, and he's leveled teams up. He's made them competitive, but really against scrubs. I mean, look at Temple. Temple is Temple. It's the American Conference. Against the Big 12 at Baylor, he beat up on a lot of weaker teams, but against Oklahoma, against Lincoln Riley Oklahoma teams, so not anyone at the level of a Ryan Day Ohio State or of a Jim Harbaugh Michigan in the previous 3 seasons, or maybe of the James Franklin teams of this year and last year in 2017, certainly not at the level of the SEC champions. He choked. And I'm not saying that because I think he's a bad coach. I'm playing a little bit extreme devil's advocate to say this loss did not help dilute or put out the flame that one could say are some Matt Rhule doubters, who certainly exist in Nebraska, certainly exist outside the program. This loss certainly gives doubt to the team. You don't think the team is reeling from this loss? I'm telling you, they certainly are. And this team from the Illinois game and from this game against Indiana, and I'm even going to say the Rutgers game, lacked toughness. That Rutgers win, I thought it was big at the time. I was deceived. I was totally deceived. And I'm sorry, Rutgers fans, for pumping up your program like I've pumped up Nebraska in prior years, and to a certain degree in this year. Rutgers just lost to UCLA by like 10 on their own home field. Transitive property says that as a result of that, UCLA is better than Nebraska. That's no longer a free win after looking at the results of those two teams from the past few weeks. Rutgers also got blown out by Wisconsin on their own home field a week before this past Saturday, a week before yesterday. And Nebraska's offense for 2 games in a row, really 3 because they did not look good against Purdue, but that's more on the special teams. 2 weeks in a row, they have looked pathetic. 4 games in a row, and there have been some concerns. There have been some obvious holes, more specifically the rushing offense. And I just think that there's a lot of truth in the fact that after a loss like this, you got to look at the coaching staff, you got to look at the roster, you even have to look at the program, the foundation, and ask some questions. I know that Curt Cignetti brought his players, and that's why Indiana in part's so good, and we'll get to that in a few minutes, but this was bad. And a few more points that I have to make. One of them is number 1 defense in S&P+. What a total joke. This is not the nation's number 1 defense. Not one bit. I was a little bit skeptical when that S&P Plus ranking came out. I'm like, are we sure this is a better defense than Iowa or a better defense than Ohio State or Penn State? And I was willing to entertain it, which is my own fault. I bought into it a little bit. You know how far it fell? And S&P Plus is not all that reactive. It still actually has Michigan inside of the top 25. S&P Plus does. They're like 24th, 25th. A lot of it is because of priors, but you know how far Nebraska's defense fell at S&P Plus. You're not going to believe this. You're not. It fell all the way to 7th. From number 1 to number 7. That's quite a bit of movement, especially this late in the season when you already have a lot of data points to sample from. They fell that hard after this game. Just totally unbelievable. Indiana, meanwhile, has both a top 25 offense and defense per S&P Plus and a top 15 offense, but more on that in a bit. Curt Cignetti pulled a Ryan Day, Kirby Smart ace out of his pocket, laid it on the poker table, And Matt Rhule and his staff, they shifted all their chips in the middle of the table because this was a big game. They prepared for this game, remember? Coming out of the bye. And Curt Cignetti just put both of his hands over like this. He pulled all those chips in. All of the chips in. He annihilated this defense. And this defense has major issues. I think it was clearly overrated by myself, by others. There's a lot of soul searching. A whole lot of it, because Ohio State will probably be able to score on this defense. USC will be able to, and Wisconsin and Iowa are competent enough on offense. I'd also say the same with UCLA after what they did to Rutgers, to where they could probably put up some points, like not 30 or 40 perhaps, but definitely in the 20s, maybe in the 30s. So this was very concerning because the defense has been Nebraska's identity. It's been their strong point both last year and this year, and they got destroyed. They got leveled. They surrendered 495 total yards, 56 total points, 215 rushing yards, 6.5 yards per carry allowed, and Indiana had 5 rushing touchdowns. Nebraska also only got to Indiana's quarterback like how many times in this game? I forget exactly. Let me check. Oh yeah, 1. They had 1 sack. They had 4 TFLs. And that 1 sack, I think, was on Curtis Rourke on the 4th down, where if Nebraska didn't bring that pressure, their secondary would have had another play where they're exposed because there was a wide open seam route for a touchdown that we know Curtis Rourke would have likely hit based off of the game that he was having then. And one more thing as well. The offense is a mess objectively. I know the defense didn't do its job. They couldn't stop a nosebleed. They couldn't stop even plays where they nearly blowed up. For example, Indiana's first 3rd down of the game, 3rd and 2, they run it with Justice Ellison on a halfback toss. Nebraska reads it. They're in position. He misdirects. Good blocking assists there to be a pathway for Ellison to run. He runs. He out-angles Nebraska defenders, and he gets very close to the red zone. And from right there, I thought to myself, okay, this is either a fluke play or this is going to be a recurring theme throughout the game. And it ended up being a recurring theme throughout the game. Again, Indiana averaged 6.5 yards per carry on the ground. And I know for a fact entering halftime they were averaging over 9 yards per carry on the ground. It was absolutely insane. But the offense, to circle back, they only scored 7 points on a defense that let Northwestern score in the 20s, that let UCLA score in the teens, that Charlotte was able to score in the teens on, and we could go on and on and on. We really could. But it was not a good performance overall. It wasn't. Nebraska, on the day, they were able to drive in between the 20s, but they were 0 of 5 on 4th down. They had 304 total yards. They averaged less than 4 yards per play. They gave up the ball 5 times. They had 20 first downs. They actually won the TOP battle, but TOP battles typically in a game like this don't mean all that much. They don't, because they had a lot of longer drives in the second half where they came up empty. Nebraska did. And I don't know why Dylan Raiola was in the game. I don't know why he was at all. And I think that given how bad the offensive line is, where Nebraska only averaged 2.4 yards per carry on the ground, a touchdown. Heinrich Harburg was the team's leading rusher. Emmett Johnson was the leading running back with 24 yards on 8 carries for 3 yards per carry. The offensive line does a pretty good job, I think, or maybe not pretty good, but they do at least an average job at pass blocking. Raiola oftentimes did have time in the pocket against Indiana, but Nebraska couldn't run the football. And Indiana was doing a pretty good job of covering, and not just covering, but tackling or getting off of Nebraska's blocks. Thomas Fidone, for example, he had a very good game through the air, and he did make some good blocks. But I can count 2 or 3 times, one on a Heinrich Harburg run to the left inside the 10, another on a screen pass, and maybe a few other times that I can't exactly recollect, where the smaller Indiana defensive back was just able to out-angle him or use his hands to quickly get off of Fidone and end the play then and there. Indiana tackled way better than Nebraska did. Indiana had not just the way better offense and special teams unit in this game, they had the far superior defense too. And I think that moving forward, because of Heinrich Harburg's mobility, and because at this point Rhule has had 2 games in a row where he is just not himself, I think that a QB change should be explored. I'm not saying it should happen because I'm not the coach, but it should be explored for sure. I think that may be a solution moving forward, if I'm being honest. And only putting up, again, 304 total yards, averaging 5.1 yards per pass attempt and 2.4 yards per carry, and having 7 negative plays on the 7 TFLs that Indiana had, that's just damning. It's really damning. And the staff is going to have to do some soul searching. And Matt Rhule, I think, this upcoming preseason or postseason, because Nebraska is not going to make the college football playoff, barring some insane miracle, they're going to have to make some tough decisions. Rhule is going to have to make some tough decisions because you have Dylan Rhule, who has phenomenal talent, and you have some other players who are very good, and they're not being maximized. They're not being developed properly or put in positions to win, or are just not being helped by their supporting cast, who, to be quite frank, is pretty mediocre. This is not a good Nebraska team relative to what at least I was expecting and to what many were expecting entering this game. This is a 6-6, 7-5, and it could be even 5-7 football team. Now they could also go 8-4, 9-3, because I do think Indiana, along with Ohio State, those are the 2 best teams by a mile on their schedule. But if the Ohio State game's a blowout again, 2 blowouts in a row, and you begin to wonder whether the team, I don't think they'll totally check out, but whether they've partially checked out. We'll just have to see. But not a good game for Nebraska whatsoever. Not one bit. I have an overreaction. Well, I don't know if it's an overreaction, but I want to communicate it to you. Is Curt Cignetti a top 10 head coach in football? This is another thing that I heard from the Nebraska faithful. Not heard too, but I tuned into Corn Crazed's reaction after the game. A lot of insightful things there. I also went back and listened to his halftime report. And there were, well, it was Connor, it was Jake, and it was John. And I forget who it was. I think it was Connor or Jake brought up the fact that Cignetti could be a top 10 head coach. And I got to be honest, with Saban leaving, retiring, with Harbaugh leaving for the NFL, with all the coaching changes that happened from 23 to 24, particularly with Saban, a massive vacuum occurred at the top of the coaching hierarchy. It did. Because most coaches are not at one end of the spectrum. Most of them are pretty close together. Then you have the outliers at the top and the outliers at the bottom. And the outliers at the top typically last a lot longer than the outliers at the bottom, who continuously rotate. Cignetti worked under Saban. He acts like Saban in the fact that he's clearly not content with just winning. He wants his team to play the best that they can do against themselves. And he knows how to recruit and he knows how to develop based off of the portal acquisitions that he made this season, off of his time at Alabama, his time at prior schools like James Madison, for example. This is a man who's ahead of a lot of what many would view it to be his peers in the Big Ten. Indiana right now is better coached than Michigan, Michigan State, Purdue, Illinois, Northwestern, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, Washington, UCLA, USC, Rutgers, Maryland. That's 14. You got Indiana, can't count them, Penn State, Ohio State, Oregon. They're better coached than 14 teams in the Big Ten. And I would say as of now, they're probably better coached than Penn State. So that's 15. I think they're more efficient with what they have than Ohio State is. That's 15th. And Oregon's not invincible. They could be the best coached team in the Big Ten. That's not a stretch. That get the negative connotations that you have with the Indiana logo. They're very understandable, but just get them out of the way. Just like I did with the positive connotations with the Michigan logo after the Washington game. After the Washington game, it's like, we know they're terrible. Do not rank them in the top 25. Do not touch them. Get off. And I was correct about the fact that Illinois would beat them. It was actually worse than I expected. Just like Indiana's win over Nebraska was much better than I expected. This is a well-coached team. And you look at his time, the quote, "I win, Google me." Well, it's applying right now. It's a meme, yes. In fact, it may be a cliche, something that's annoying, but is true. He does win. They're going to be favored over Washington, even with Rourke resting in that game. They're going to be favored over Michigan State, over Michigan. They're going to be favored over Purdue. And I think Ohio State's going to beat them as of right now. I think Ohio State is better, perhaps significantly better. But Indiana could be better than Ohio State because we're approaching this point to where Ohio State's win over Iowa now kind of looks, well, only impressive in rushing offense. I mean, Iowa's 4-3. Michigan State just put a 30-burger on them, exactly what Ohio State did. So Ohio State no longer has an impressive win. They just have a loss that's very painful. And yeah, I mean, Indiana's just blowing out people left and right, no matter who they play. And that puts them in the conversation with Penn State, Ohio State, and Oregon. Like, I know those three teams are rated better than Indiana in power ratings, but you take the fact that they haven't faced each other yet, and we're only a little over halfway done with the schedule, and the remaining standard deviation or error that these power ratings have relative to the future of the 2024 season means that at the end of the year, Indiana could potentially be the best team in the Big Ten. I don't think it'll happen, but it could, and it's time to talk about that. 126 wins, 35 losses. Indiana this season, they are scoring a whopping 48.7 points per game, and they're only allowing 13.7. Yeah. Finally, not finally, but to kind of conclude the earlier point, I do think Indiana is a near elite to elite college football team. Again, Cignetti pulled a Ryan Day, Kirby Smart move. He annihilated an overrated defense, an overrated team, but I don't know how overrated Nebraska is. Indiana may just be this good. Let me show you the efficiency metrics for Indiana. They're crazy. I mean, if you heard these things in the preseason, you wouldn't have believed me, but alas, that's been the case for a lot of these teams. Indiana is 5th in overall efficiency behind Ohio State, Texas, Georgia, and Ole Miss. The only reason they're behind Ole Miss is because Ole Miss beat up on a bunch of scrubs, lower-level FCS teams and Group of 5 teams, who would all be beaten by Nebraska, many of whom would probably lose to UCLA and Northwestern, teams who Indiana dominated. Indiana has the most efficient offense in all of college football, number 1, with a 94.4 efficiency rating, which means Indiana is first nationally based off of the offense's contribution to scoring margin on a play-by-play or on a per-play basis, adjusted for strength of opposing defenses faced. Basically, look at points per play margin and then how much Indiana's offense contributes to their points per play margin. Well, Indiana is the best offense in the country when accounting for the offensive contribution to the points per play margin. Basically, Indiana has the most dominant offense in all of college football. And the 94.4 efficiency metric is comparable to Michigan's 92.9 defensive efficiency metric last year for a defense that was generationally talented. And that defense didn't play anyone of note on offense really until Ohio State or Maryland. And you could say Penn State because their scoring offense was good, but they just had a top 30, top 25, maybe top 20 at best offense. So someone, but not any offense that had really elite potential. And they finished the season number 1 when they were number 1 defensively for much of the year. I mean, Indiana's putting up generationally good numbers on offense. As insane as that sounds. But it's factually true. They are ahead of Ohio State, who's also in the 90s per efficiency on offense. They're ahead of Oregon, who's lower 80s. They're ahead of Georgia, LSU, Boise State. They're ahead of Navy. They're ahead of Clemson. They're ahead of Miami. Miami's very good offensively. They're ahead of Army. Army is putting up insane numbers on the ground and even through the air. They're ahead of Penn State. Penn State, like Oregon, has elite offensive coordinators. I mean, this is a great team. They're one of the better teams in college football. And the numbers they put up, 56 points, 280 passing yards, 215 rushing yards, over 9 yards per attempt in the air, over 6 yards per carry on the ground, 5 rushing touchdowns, 5 forced turnovers, 2 sacks, 7 TFLs, forcing their opponent to go 0 out of 5 attempts on 4th down. That's the mark of a team that's dangerous. This is a team who can reach the college football playoff, who can win the Big Ten. I'm not going to go this far yet, but we may have to at some point talk about Indiana having the potency to win it all. Which honestly I hope happens, because that would be quite the story. And speaking of that, I do think the ceiling is limitless, at least in the regular season. Indiana's currently 7-0, 4-0 in Big Ten play right now. They're 11-1, 8-1, /12-0, 9-0 when you look at their best possible outcome. That's a playoff team. Their best possible scenario, and at this point, their most likely scenario, I do think, is 11-1, results in appearing in the college football playoff. Worst case scenario, at Michigan State, could be an L. At Ohio State, could very much be an L. Between Washington and Michigan, maybe Indiana has a down game. Worst case scenario is probably 9-3. At the extreme, more likely 10-2. That's insane. And you look at ESPN's FPI, which takes probability into account. It doesn't just say if you're favored to win, 60%, that counts as a whole win. No, if you're given a 60% chance to win, you're given 0.6 wins and 0.4 losses, that type of thing. Indiana's projected to go 10.8 and 1.5. 10.8 wins, 1.5 losses. You look at the probability to win the conference, and you exclusively zoom in on the Big Ten, Indiana has the 3rd best odds to win the conference. And I'm pretty sure that if you look at odds to reach Indianapolis, they're probably tied with Penn State there. And even perhaps tied with Oregon. I mean, it's just it's bonkers. It's crazy. I mean, the odds to reach Indy, actually, they're not tied with Oregon. Oregon at this point is basically a guarantee. I meant tied with Ohio. They could be tied with Ohio State in odds to reach Indianapolis. The fact that Indiana can reach the Big Ten, they can win the Big Ten, that they can reach the college football playoff is crazy. And what that leads me to say, outside of these statistics in power ratings that I'm presenting to you, is that Cignetti should be locked down by Indiana ASAP. Indiana's 11th in FPI, 12th in S&P+, 12th in K-Ford. They're anywhere from 17 to 19 points better than the average college football team, looking at those statistics. And last but not least, the game MVP is quarterback Curtis Rourke. He was 17 of 21 for 189 yards, a touchdown, a pick, 162.7 passer rating, and an 89.8 QBR. He's one of the best quarterbacks in the nation. I hope that his thumb heals. I hope that he gets back in action as soon as possible, because with how he's been passing the football, they're certainly going to beat up Michigan's defense and all the NFL players there because of bad coaching. They could do to Ohio State's defense what Oregon just did. I know they don't have the same athleticism, but man, with that quarterback accuracy, with Rourke's potential, and with the coaching, they could. Indiana's ceiling, again, limitless. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488 and Nebraska Rascal for being Heisman members and sponsoring this video and channel. Thanks to Chris Lane, Ismar Taylor, 9, Schultz, and Kush for being All-American members. Thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Joshua Jorgensen, and Will Loftus for being all conference members as well. Check out my Patreon page, merchandise store, and Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. Have a great day, everyone. Go Hoosiers, and go Big Red.